In 1933, the Soviet government is accepted by most of the world's main powers.
With the sole purpose of the maintenance.
At last, the communists have obtained recognition from the United States under Franklin D. Roosevelt.
None of us will be satisfied.
In his approval, the American president recalls that for years, the two countries have not had diplomatic relations, and expresses his hope that in the future they can work together to strengthen peaceful cooperation in the civilized world.
In turning out finished airplanes. We're working day and night.
American recognition gives Stalin international prestige.
And to catch up.
He believes his authoritarian methods have been overlooked and interprets Roosevelt's words as backing for his continuance in government.
Hand tied behind its back.
Not long afterwards, the Soviet Union begins a policy of trading with the West, essential to eradicate poverty and hunger throughout the country. But while the democracies are unable to reach agreement on whether Stalin's regime is better or worse than Hitler's, the Soviet dictator once again demonstrates his lack of scruples and revolutionary ideals. He signs a pact with Hitler, which makes him an accomplice to the destruction of Poland. Later, he invades Finland and annexes Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. His behavior is remarkably like that of the Nazi leader. Both view power in the same way. With characteristic indifference, he watches the defeat of France and the British struggle against the Germans as something completely removed from his government. Deeply suspicious of Hitler's intentions, he tries to gain time, maintaining the troops of the Third Reich as far away as possible from the Soviet frontiers. He orders the production of armaments on a massive scale and hugely increases the number of troops in his armies. Everything is done with the aim of repulsing an attack by Hitler's forces, which Stalin sees as certain. Although Stalin was hardly Churchill's favorite statesman, the British leader, in an act of solidarity, had communicated to him all the information obtained by his secret service, indicating that Hitler had been planning the occupation of Soviet territory since the summer of 1940. With the help of von Paulus, by the 18th of December 1940, the Nazi leader had finalized the main lines of strategy for the attack, which were set down in secret in Directive Number 21, named Operation Barbarossa. Hitler intends the invasion to be a short campaign. 3 powerful armies, together with the Luftwaffe, are to strike and rapidly destroy the weak points of the Soviet armed forces. He is convinced his plan will meet with resounding success and comments to his general staff, "With just a kick at the door, I will destroy the rotten Bolshevik structure. I will expel the Russians from their lands and make their territory in Eden, which will be occupied by Germans." (1941). At the start of 1941, the Fuhrer informed Goering of the start date for the invasion of the Soviet Union. The head of the Luftwaffe is worried that this action will end the air offensive against Britain, but Hitler reassures him that the best way to finish off Britain is by invading Russia. June. Moscow is the main objective for the Nazi leader. It is only a name. The Bolsheviks are in Leningrad and Stalingrad. He tells his generals, "The war against Russia is primarily ideological and racial, which means all of them should be wiped out like rats." With this in mind, his strategy involves SS and Gestapo units following in the wake of the army in order to carry out operations of political and ethnic cleansing with total impunity. So that these may be free of the interference of other forces, he names the fanatical Alfred Rosenberg as Minister of the Eastern Territories. Hitler's arrogance knows no limits. He considers himself superior to Napoleon. He will not be defeated by nature or the distances involved. He can count on the speed of the Wehrmacht on land and the Luftwaffe in the air, which leads him to believe that the mistakes of the past cannot be repeated in the case of the Third Reich. The German officers and men, who at this moment are situated along the border of German-occupied Poland facing the Soviets, do not believe there will be an invasion. "We are here for other reasons. The Russians are our allies. We have divided this land between us, and they provide us with wheat and oil," they tell each other. Meanwhile, Stalin is resting at his house on the Black Sea, carefully going over the reports he has received from Churchill since the previous autumn warning him of Hitler's intentions. In the early hours of the 22nd of June, 1941, in Berlin, a depressed Goebbels, who was not a supporter of this adventure, reads over the radio the Fuhrer's proclamation of the invasion of the Soviet Union, which began that morning.
Wir haben den Kampf gegen das Judentum jahrelang geführt.
More than 3 million soldiers advance at great speed along a 3,000-kilometer front with the aim of destroying the enemy before the end of the summer. Army Group North, commanded by Field Marshal Wilhelm Ritter, made up of 29 divisions and 570 tanks, is accompanied by the 1st Luftflotte of General Keller. They are charged with attacking the Baltic region and Leningrad. The German forces in the center, commanded by Field Marshal Fedor von Bock, march on Smolensk and Moscow. 49 divisions and 930 tanks can count on the air cover of Luftflotte 2 of General Kesselring. General von Rundstedt's Army Group South heads for the Ukraine and the Caucasus with 42 divisions and 750 tanks, and has air support from the 4th Luftflotte under Captain Lear. During the first hours of the attack, the Nazi Air Force destroys more than 60 Soviet aerodromes and thousands of planes on the ground. The forces of the Third Reich have once again used blitzkrieg, surprising the Soviets. The German General Staff has no doubt about the military superiority of its armies and believes the Soviets will collapse. For Hitler and the OKW, the psychological impact of the offensive on the population is vital, and they order the heavy bombing of Minsk, Rovno, Odessa, Kaunas, and Sebastopol in parallel to the invasion. The surprised Soviet soldiers desperately communicate the news from different points along the frontier. Stalin and his government try to halt the attack by diplomatic means, given that a non-aggression pact exists between the two countries. But they soon realize their efforts are doomed to fail. The enemy cannot be stopped with words. The worst predictions about Hitler have come true. Semyon Timoshenko, Commissar for Defense, urgently meets with the General Staff to prepare the defense strategy. Stalin reminds them of Napoleon's failure in 1812. The bulk of the Soviet forces have been divided into 5 fronts. In the north, under the command of General Popov. In the northeast, commanded by General Kuzinov. In the west, under General Pavlov. The southeast front is in the charge of General Kirponos, and the south under the authority of General Telugin. The Soviets have put more than 12 million men on a war footing, ordering civilians to fight alongside the army against the invading forces. But the enormous destructive capacity of the Luftwaffe and the Wehrmacht enables the Germans to advance without meeting much resistance in the north and center, where the Polish peasants naively welcome them as liberators from Russian tyranny. By the end of the 22nd, the Third Reich's troops have been able to breach the Soviet lines to the north of Grodno and invade the cities of Kobry and Pruzhany. However, in the south, the advance of Rudsted's soldiers has been halted by strong Soviet resistance. Stalin has placed a larger number of troops in the Ukraine in order to block the path of the German advance on Kiev. Upon receiving the news of Hitler's latest aggression, Churchill announces to the British people on the radio that, despite the fact that he is an enemy of communism, Britain will help the Soviet Union in every way it can, and in this way, benefit her own cause. Speaking to the American people, Roosevelt condemns the Nazi aggression and justifies the important increase in armaments being offered to Britain by land, sea, and air, hinting that a part of this could be used on the Russian front. Mussolini, who was in Rome, had received a letter from Hitler shortly before the invasion, in which he clearly stated his intentions, which the Italian dictator already knew about in part. The Duce, in what is largely a theatrical gesture, declares war on the Soviet Union and offers the Fuhrer a battalion of Italian soldiers. On the 26th, the troops of Field Marshal Fedor begin the siege of the fortress of Brest-Litovsk. In their advance towards Minsk, the Germans, in only 4 days, have covered more than 300 kilometers, with their panzer division supported by the Luftwaffe. In Belarus, they destroy the Red Army in the cities of Bialystok, Novogrudok, and Volkivsk. Shortly afterwards, they reach the river Berezina and advance towards the Dnieper in search of strategic points to establish bridgeheads that will facilitate the advance of the infantry and armored divisions on Moscow. In their wake are the pitiless SS Death's Head units charged with the murder of the men, women, and children. The armies of the South, with their amphibious tanks, cross the River Bug and clear the way for the infantry's advance into Soviet territory. In the north, Ritter's troops cross the River Dwina and advance in the direction of Leningrad. The Finnish government, taking advantage of the situation, declares war on the Soviet Union and orders its armies to attack the Russian soldiers occupying a part of its territory. At the end of the month, the British Secret Service is able to decipher the Enigma code used by the Germans on the Eastern Front and communicate intercepted messages to the Soviet High Command. Knowledge of German troop movements gives the Soviets a respite, but the lack of resources prevents them from halting the advance. In these circumstances, Stalin imposes a scorched earth policy, ordering his armies, in the event of withdrawal, to burn and destroy the towns and villages, together with anything that could be useful to the enemy. The partisans are charged with fighting a guerrilla war, carrying out attacks aimed at destroying telephone lines, railways, and other communications that fall into German hands. July. On the 1st of July, the German armies in the north begin Operation Silver Fox to try to occupy the Soviet port of Murmansk in the Arctic, through which the majority of supplies from Britain and the United States enter. Partisans and Red Army soldiers are able to frustrate the Nazi plans and keep open the supply route so vital to the Soviet troops. On the 3rd, Stalin, for the first time since the start of the invasion, speaks to the Soviet people over the radio. He employs the terms brothers, friends, and Mother Russia, though his intentions are clear. Our people are in grave danger. We have an obligation to defend them with our lives. Those who do not do so will be accused of treason and judged by military tribunals. For their part, the British continue their bombing, pounding key points of the Third Reich's industry. Churchill promises Stalin he will increase attacks on selected areas of Germany in the hope of relieving the pressure on the Soviet Union. On the 8th, German troops marching towards Leningrad enter Pskov. General Korbakov, in command of the Soviet forces in the area, is unable to stop the enemy advance and is forced to retreat. Stalin accuses him of treason and orders his immediate execution. 2 days later, The Reich's armies situated in the south, commanded by von Rundstedt, cross the Stalin line and their panzer divisions are within 14 kilometers of Kiev, where the Soviet troops are strongly entrenched. On the 11th, the OKW informs Hitler that the first phase of Operation Barbarossa has been satisfactorily completed. A total of 330,000 soldiers have been taken prisoner, and 2,000 artillery pieces and 3,000 tanks have been captured. The Fuhrer is convinced that final victory is at hand, and euphorically tells close associates, the Crimea will be the German Côte d'Azur. He goes on to tell Franz Halder, chief of the Army General Staff, that the inhabitants of the conquered cities must be annihilated, as it would cost Germany too much to feed them during the winter. On the 12th of July, the Luftwaffe begins bombing Moscow. General Guderian, in place in the outskirts with his Panzer Group II, waits to make a victorious entry in the capital in the next few days. But the Fuhrer disappoints his expectations, ordering him to move southwards to confront the Soviet Fifth Army situated in the Pripyat marshes. Later, he is to join the pincer operation on Kiev. In the north, Field Marshal Ritter's forces are stalled to the south of Leningrad, near Lake Ilmen, preparing the final assault on the city. The Red Army troops and volunteer groups await the German attack in their trenches. But Stalin is ready to halt the march of the armies on the Third Reich. While they reorganize their positions, the Soviet artillery is reinforced with the new Katyusha rocket launchers, and the defenses of Moscow and Leningrad are strengthened with large contingents of soldiers. At the same time, the communist leader puts pressure on Churchill to keep up the aerial bombardment of Germany. In response, on the 14th, British bombers attacked Hanover, Hamburg, Frankfurt, Mannheim, and Berlin. The city of Odessa on the Black Sea and the wheat fields and industrial zones of the Ukraine are now the main objective of the German General Staff. Hitler is convinced that the Soviet Union has its days numbered and tells Alfred Rosenberg, if the Russians, once defeated, try to carry on a partisan war, it will provide the justification before the world to exterminate them all. He gives Himmler absolute policing authority in the occupied territories. For the Fuhrer, Himmler and his death squads, which are assassinating thousands of citizens behind the lines, is proof of the policy of ethnic cleansing. On the 23rd, after suffering continuous shelling from Kart howitzers, each one weighing more than 2 tons, and a month's siege, the heroic garrison at Brest-Litovsk falls into German hands. On the 27th, soldiers of the Third Reich take Smolensk and capture 120,000 prisoners, among them Stalin's eldest son, Yakov. At the same time, the planes of the Luftwaffe drop tons of bombs on Moscow for the 5th consecutive time. The situation is reaching breaking point for the Soviets. Stalin senses defeat staring him in the face and confesses to Molotov, "We are going to lose everything Lenin achieved in the revolution." Demoralized and frightened, he blames some of the officers in charge of the troops and orders a new purge in which Generals Oavlov, Klimovsky, Korobkov, and Piadyshev are shot, among others. General von Waldau, a member of the German General Staff, comments to his colleagues that the triumph over the Slavic hordes proclaimed by the Fuhrer is at hand. At the end of July, more than 800,000 prisoners had been captured, and almost 12 million Soviet tanks had been taken or destroyed. What could an army do in these circumstances? But some members of the High Command don't share his optimism, voicing their concerns to Hitler in the headquarters of Rastenburg. The Soviets know how to withdraw and regroup, giving themselves just enough time to carry out surprise counterattacks, which makes their annihilation impossible and generates frustration among German soldiers and officers. The Nazi leader believes the solution is to get the Japanese to attack Russia from the east and open up a new front that will force the Soviets to divide their forces. One of the most pessimistic commanders, Admiral Canaris, remarks to the adjutant, "I fear that this war will end up strengthening the Bolsheviks and weakening the Third Reich." Stalin, meanwhile, welcomes to Moscow Harry Hopkins, one of President Roosevelt's closest advisors, who informs him of the United States' willingness to send military material to the front. The Soviet leader once more insists on the opening of a new front in the north of Europe. August. At the start of August, the Red Army has been on the retreat for almost 2 months. However, its continuous counterattacks and the constant increase of fighters are slowing down the German advance. A worried Hitler confesses to Guderian, "If I had been informed of the enormous quantity of soldiers and combat vehicles the Russians possess, the invasion would have been carried out differently." In mid-August, the Soviet troops withdraw across the river Dnieper to regroup and carry out attacks on strategic points. The Fuhrer believes the only way to put an end to the communist tactics is by undertaking enveloping maneuvers to finally trap the bulk of their soldiers. Meanwhile, Churchill and Roosevelt, holding discussions off the coast of Newfoundland, decide to substantially increase aid to the Soviet front, turning a blind eye to the Russian dictator's paranoid persecution of some of his army commanders, whom he accuses of helping the enemy and orders to be shot for being unpatriotic. On the 15th of August, Hinrich Lose, Reich Commissar for the occupied part of the Soviet Union, orders Jews to wear 2 yellow badges, one on the chest and the other on the back. They are forced to live in ghettos or concentration camps and eat what other people leave. Those that are healthy are sent to do forced labor to help Greater Germany in the building of roads and bridges. In an act of genocide, SS General Franz Jacqueline orders 23,000 Jews to be shot in 48 hours. Churchill, once again, denounces the cruelty of Hitler's regime, describing how the Nazis are murdering thousands of Russians in cold blood. Not since Europe was invaded by the Mongols had there been such brutality and disregard for human life, he said. September. The Finnish forces, once they have retaken the land occupied by the Soviets in 1939, halt their advance at Terioki, with no intention of advancing any further. In the north of the Soviet Union, Leningrad continues under siege and cut off. At the start of the month, the Germans take Maga and cut the rail links between the city and the rest of the country. The only way of entering and leaving is through Lake Ladoga. Hitler informs Field Marshal von Lieb he has authorization to destroy the city by land and from the air. Shortly afterwards, the Luftwaffe dropped 6,000 incendiary bombs on the city. On the 6th, Soviet troops launch a counterattack and recapture Yelnya, which relieves the pressure on Moscow. Stalin orders the deportation to the east of around 1 million ethnic Germans who, for centuries, have lived in the Volga region. He fears acts of sabotage from pro-Nazi groups. On the 9th, following air attacks from the Luftwaffe, Army Group North recommences the land assault on Leningrad, which is repulsed by an impressive barrage of shells from the Russian batteries. Hitler is impatient to take the main Soviet cities before winter, but the communist resistance is not making it easy. He decides on a change of tactics and regroups his forces to take firstly Kiev and then Moscow. For this, he orders part of his divisions besieging Leningrad to support the attack on the Soviet capital. He is confident hunger will force the capitulation of Leningrad. Von Lieb attempts a final assault before transferring his combat vehicles to the Moscow front. But the Soviet defensive lines again prove too strong. Taking advantage of the German movements, Marshal Zhukov decides to counterattack to eliminate some enemy positions. But some of the officers and men refuse, making it impossible to carry out the action. This provokes the fury of Stalin, who orders the immediate execution of all of those that refuse to participate in the counteroffensive or try to desert. Thousands of soldiers die without being able to force back the German troops. After a number of weeks under heavy German artillery fire and seeing thousands of his men losing their lives, on the 11th of September, Marshal Budyenniny requests permission to withdraw to Kiev. The Soviet dictator replies, "Stop looking for excuses and resist until the end." Marshal Timoshenko supports the withdrawal and asks Stalin to reconsider, but the Soviet leader refuses to budge. On the 19th, after a month of fierce fighting, Kiev cannot resist further and surrenders. The Germans capture more than 500,000 Soviet soldiers, while SS units murder thousands of inhabitants. Stalin's obstinacy and disregard for human life has caused the collapse of the armies on the southwestern front and, with that, the possibility that the whole of the Ukraine falls into the hands of von Manstein's panzer divisions, which are now advancing on Rostov. However, if necessary, the Soviet leader is prepared to sacrifice the whole population of his country. On the 25th, he receives confirmation that Japan will not attack Russia and orders the transfer of half the soldiers situated on the Eastern Front to the defensive lines around Moscow. General Zhukov abandons Leningrad and assumes command of the troops situated in and around the Russian capital, which is reinforced with new and powerful T-34 tanks. Meanwhile, hundreds of thousands of volunteers help the army to construct the defensive lines around the city. Moscow will continue fighting until the last man, the communist dictator announces as he proclaims the state of siege. On the 30th of September, the armies of the Reich begin Operation Typhoon, with the aim of taking the capital. October. Heavy rains in the early days of October put the brakes on the German advance, though the 2nd Panzer Group is able to capture the cities of Vyazma and Bryansk, trapping 600,000 Red Army soldiers and 1,500 tanks. But the great difficulties imposed by the weather force a temporary halt to be called to Operation Typhoon on the 8th. The victory before the end of the summer promised by Hitler to his general staff has not been achieved. General Winter is causing problems for the German troops and their equipment. The cold and the lack of food has engendered a strong feeling of failure among the soldiers of the Reich, similar to that which is affecting the German population as a whole, supporting the loss of 87,000 men since the beginning of the invasion. The British and Americans take advantage of the winter interlude to send thousands of planes and tanks, along with machine guns, clothes, ammunition, fuel, and medicine to the Soviet front. On the 16th, the Germans occupy Odessa and enter Kharkov, the country's 4th biggest city. Once more, Hitler shows his disregard for human life and sends a message to von Reichenau saying, "Nature itself constantly causes death. It is the only way for the fittest to survive." He wants no obstructions to the work of the SS. November. On the 7th of November, Stalin presides over the parade of troops in Red Square, heading for the front. The United States has included the Soviet Union in the Lend-Lease Act, and the RAF is subjecting Germany's big cities to intense bombing. For the Soviets, the defeat of the Nazis is a question of time. In the south, in the mouth of the River Don, Hitler's soldiers attacked the Ukrainian city of Rostov. The Communist Ninth Army resists until the 21st, when the Germans are able to reach the city center. 1 week later, the Soviets counterattack and recover it completely. As a consequence, one of the Reich's most charismatic generals, von Rundstedt, is obliged to step down. The Fuhrer does not accept failure. The winter weather worsens. The steppes and cities are covered with a thick layer of snow, temperatures dropping to 25 degrees below zero. The Germans are disheartened by weather forecasts predicting a long, cold winter. The cold, the rain, and the snow are sweeping away our dreams, the Luftwaffe's General Hoffmann writes to his family. At the end of November, only 25 kilometers from Moscow, the soldiers of the Reich halt their march. Their weapons are frozen and fire only intermittently, and they are afraid of falling asleep from exhaustion while on duty and freezing to death. December. Field Marshal von Brauchitsch, the commander-in-chief of the German armies, suffers a heart attack as a result of tension related to events on the Eastern Front. Hitler calls his commanders weak and inept, and on the 8th issues Directive Number 39, suspending Operation Typhoon and ordering all troops to withdraw to defensive positions to await the spring. Some in the OKW, the German High Command of the Armed Forces, had lost confidence in the Fuhrer's ability to direct the war. There were many occasions in which he was not in touch with reality, and in some operations, his hasty decisions put the fighting capacity of the Wehrmacht in danger. On different occasions, Hitler had been warned of the enormous difficulties the troops were facing on Russian soil. The extent of the front disperses the force of our armies, his advisors told him. But Hitler believed that he had the solution. He would concentrate all efforts on reaching one objective. "We will occupy the Caucasus," he told Jold. The Nazi leader believed this region was the Bolshevik storehouse and the back door to the British Empire. With the Caucasus in his hands, he would have the British and the Soviets at his mercy, which would mean the end of the war in a short space of time. (1942) January. The sudden halt on the part of the German troops gives Stalin and his general staff time to plan a general counteroffensive. Despite the provisions from the Allies and continuous production of armaments in factories moved to Siberia, resources are still scarce. Even so, the counterattacks begin at the start of January on 4 fronts: Leningrad in the north, Moscow in the center, and in the south in the Ukraine and the Crimean Peninsula. experienced by Napoleon's armies. As far as the Nazi leader is concerned, all the blame belongs to his generals who have not followed his orders. He removes more than 30 of them from their posts, alleging, "These career officers have studied the theory, but they know nothing of the practice." Meanwhile, the Soviet counterattacks at different points along the front do not cease. On the 27th of January, Marshal Timoshenko crosses the river Donets, forcing the Germans to retreat and take up defensive positions. In the north, Leningrad continues to resist the incessant bombing of the Luftwaffe. Despite having evacuated more than 500,000 of its inhabitants, thousands of people are dying of hunger and sickness due to the lack of supplies. February. The RAF continues uninterrupted bombing of German cities. The Allied revenge has begun with a massive storm of explosives, which will last until the end of the war, razing to the ground the large cities and causing the deaths of more than 500,000 people. May. In the Soviet Union, the Germans' spring counteroffensive begins on the 8th, with the objective of recapturing the positions lost during the winter. On the Crimean front, the Soviets lose the Kerch Peninsula and have to retreat once more to the river Donets. June. Sebastopol resists German shelling, including that of Dora, the largest piece of artillery in the world. Meanwhile, in Czechoslovakia, the sadistic Nazi governor Richard Heydrich is assassinated by the Czech resistance in an operation planned with the help of the British Secret Service. One of the greatest criminals of the Third Reich is dead. Behind him, he has left a trail of immense suffering and pain among millions of people in Europe. On the 18th, in the Second Washington Conference, Churchill and Roosevelt planned the strategy to follow in Europe in 1943. The Second Front in Europe, which Stalin has been calling for, will not yet be possible, as the British Prime Minister has persuaded the US President that an Allied invasion of North Africa is the next step to be taken. The Soviets will have to continue resisting the German onslaught alone, which has now set its sights on Stalingrad.